And we're on. Welcome, everybody. This is Nick Astor, founder and publisher of TriplePundit.com. Welcome once again to our weekly Google Hangout. This week we have a very special hangout, a whole panel for you to talk to today. We are being joined by Julia Alexander. She is the Director of Urban Development for Siemens. Mukhtiar Tanda is a partner in urban development at a firm called Berwin Leighton Paisner. He's having a few technical difficulties. We'll hope that he's going to join us shortly. And David MacGray, he is the infrastructure director at PwC. The impetus for today's chat is to talk about investor-ready cities, or how cities can create and deliver infrastructure value. I'd like you guys just to take a moment to introduce yourselves real quick first, and then we'll get rolling with the questions. Julie, you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Nick. So my name's Julie Alexander. As Nick says, I'm a Director of Urban Development based in Crystal in London. It's Siemens Sustainable Cities Initiative, where we look at how the impacts of infrastructure can help cities tackle some of the megatrends of today.
And I can see it going on in the background there with the
cable car in the background.
Fantastic, fantastic. David, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, thank you very much, Nick. So my name is David MacGray, and as Nick mentioned, I'm a infrastructure director here in our London-based practice, just a few miles west of Julie down the river. Here in London and throughout the world, PwC offers a significant amount of assistance to clients in the public and private sector space in terms of how to design, build, finance, procure, sale, and ultimately decommission as required infrastructure assets. And that's been something we've been doing for about 30 years or so.
Great, thank you, David. As I mentioned, the topic of this chat is inspired by a report that you all collaboratively worked on called Investor Ready Cities. That's a downloadable PDF. If folks out there haven't yet had a chance to look at it, you'll see a link directly above this video where you can go ahead and download it and have a look. I thought I would ask the two of you a little bit about the background of this report, where it came from, why was it launched, and what do we really mean when we talk about the need for cities to be, quote, investor ready? Julie, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So our three businesses, we work together anyway, day to day, and when we were talking to one another through our activities, we realized that cities are all struggling with very similar problems. One of the problems that cities face today is a lack of public funds. They have huge infrastructure projects that we need to deliver to kind of the big challenges, whether that's transportation infrastructure, energy resilience, reinforcing their energy networks, these kind of things. They take a lot of planning, they take a lot of investment, but there's no public finance available, particularly at this point in time, and that's not likely to change. And so we felt there was a need for them to understand the kind of things that they need to do to be able to work with the private sector, highlighting some of the key issues. And when we were in the early stages of preparing the report, we talked about all the various things that we could include, and there are quite a lot of issues that we can talk to cities about, but we decided to start really back at the basics, looking at the governance issues and the financing that potentially is available to cities if they follow certain principles. So from our point of view, Siemens, it's really about how do we help cities deliver that infrastructure that's so important to them. And then with BLP, a legal firm, looking at the governance issues that they're facing when they talk to cities, and PwC bringing in their expertise and more sophisticated financing mechanisms that are available to cities. And then I'll pass over to David for his view on how this came about.
David, the PwC perspective?
Well, thank you both. I think over the years, as Julie indicated, we've had a lot of experience in seeing some things that have worked well, and unfortunately some things that that haven't worked well. And it's very, I think, heartbreaking to see a client, a public authority, project sponsor who has worked a long time and put a lot of money into a project, only to find that project ends up on the cutting room floor relatively late in the shooting of the movie, if you will. And we have had, I think, bitter experiences no doubt many listeners out there will have as well, as they're trying to get capital into their projects from their organization, be it public or private. Only the best prepared ones ever make it. There's never enough to go around, and as we say in the report, as the philosopher once said, to govern is to choose. So we've seen firsthand here in the UK the impact of a poorly prepared procurement. And just to take an example of a hospital procurement in the late 90s, every hospital had been starved of capital. Every hospital tried to get out into the market, and they all hit the market at the same time. There was little order in the market. There was little depth or capacity on either the private or the public side. And unfortunately, half of the tenders were cancelled. And then that represented a huge waste of time and money for all parties. So clearly, that's not in anyone's interest, is to have poorly prepared projects advanced on either side. And a recognition that project preparation is very worthwhile in terms of the end success is something that we see a lot in our day job, and we try to bring it to our broader messaging.
Thanks, David. Mukhtiar, welcome. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Good, good. Thanks so much for jumping in. We've just gone through intros, and we were talking a little bit about the report, which folks have had the opportunity to download and check out, Investor Ready Cities. Would you mind just give us a real quick intro to who you are, and then tell us a little bit about the role you've played in this report and what the report means to you?
Sure. I'm a partner in a law firm here in London, Berwin Leighton Paisner, and I specialise in urban development, acting for private sector investors, developers, funding bodies, as well as public sector bodies, acting for municipalities as well as governments. So we do a range of projects, from acting on sort of key big projects like the delivery of the Olympic Village, through to other projects in other jurisdictions, the Middle East or Far East, in this area.
Got it.
So, and then, so you want me then to go on to?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your role in the Investor Ready Cities report, and sort of the reasoning behind this report, and why it's significant.
Sure. I mean, I think from our perspective, it was really just looking at urban development in a global context and appreciating the scale of the challenges that cities face and their need to engage with private sector, both to bring in their skills as well as their investment. And those challenges are complex and multifaceted, and they require a holistic approach to resolve them. And from our perspective, on the legal governance side, that's something that permeates across the piece and is often overlooked. So the ability for certainly an environment to attract and adopt particular funding structures will often directly correlate to the state and maturity of the legal environment within which the city or the geography is operating.
Got it. So a question to you all. Throughout the report, you talk about something you call, quote, a new urban dynamic. I'm curious to know exactly what you mean by that, and in a nutshell, how have cities changed over the last, let's say, decade in that regard? Julie, can you kick us off with that?
Sure. Well, just on the issue of how cities have changed, I think depending on where we look in the world, we see very different things. Primarily in regions such as Latin America and in Asia, what we're seeing is a huge growth in cities. This move towards urbanization, the impact that's having on cities and how they deliver services. The things that cities are really keen to do is deliver services efficiently, affordably, reliably, and they're struggling to do that today with the huge impacts that are coming about through the population growth. So I think what we'll see perhaps in some of the European cities maybe is a shrinking of population, but these cities still face challenges because typically their infrastructure is older, it needs upgrading, so there are still similar needs in terms of providing new infrastructure, upgrading infrastructure. But those needs vary and change throughout the world. But nevertheless, cities need to be more agile. They need to act more. They need to be more flexible and act in a way that is in keeping with modern day expectations and the expectations of the people that live and work and invest in those cities. So the infrastructure has to be efficient and it has to attract people in. Every city has an element of competition with cities within their region. And what we're trying to do is attract that business and that investment. We're trying to bring in people to the city to create that economic growth that they need. That then gives them the revenue streams that they need to deliver some more of this infrastructure. So again, it really is depending on your geographic location, the type of issues that you're facing. But nevertheless, what cities have to do about that is very similar.
David, comments?
Sure. I think what pattern is probably visible in many countries is just the increasing density with which you are seeing people flow into urban centers. Now, it's very easy to say that we're sitting in London, traditionally a dense center, but recent, I think, demographic shifts in places diverse as India have an enormous demand on the basic services, water, sanitation, the energy intensity of a city as it rapidly urbanizes and a rural catchment becomes an urban nucleus, if you will. You will have a completely different approach to mass transit at the level of individual density that starts to make a road a less good investment, a bus a more good investment, and rapid transit an even better investment. That has significant consequences for power supplies, for land assembly, for social dynamic, for a great many of the sort of geographic and social aspects of the city as you attempt to weave new infrastructure through, in many cases, a historic facility. And in other cases, where you have a brand new city, you may have exactly the opposite problem. You have an easy condition to build in because you know where the asset is going to go, but you have no idea who is going to use it and whether the population will take off in that particular area of the city or not. So the challenges differ. I think you've got pockets of growth in different parts of the city, and then you can have former industrial areas that have too much power supply, and residential areas now even that don't, would be a sort of an unheard of situation just a little while ago. But grid expansion, particularly in some Western countries such as the UK, has really fallen behind, even in urban centers.
Hope to hear any thoughts on the significance of the quote-unquote new urban dynamic that hasn't been said.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with everything that both David and Julie just said in terms of the scale of, and the pace and the increasing competition that cities face to attract investment. And cities need to be able to adapt to meet those challenges, and certainly from a legal perspective, the legal regulatory codes and frameworks in which they are operating need to allow them the flexibility to accommodate those opportunities and to deliver at the same time, as well as delivering investor certainty. So in order to do that, that requires a certain amount of forward planning for them to both understand where they currently stand and also to put in train steps to address shortcomings well in advance of when they go out to the market to bring projects forward. Otherwise, they are continually on the back foot, and as I think just catching the back end of what David was saying when I joined the call, projects are in danger of being pulled and investor confidence will, in that instance, be hit. But ultimately, cities are the ones that are the closest to the coalface because they have the devolved responsibility for delivering growth and addressing the challenges. And therefore, it is really for cities to start setting the agenda to engage with the central government if need to be, where areas of public law need to be addressed, or alternatively address them themselves where they can do it through local legislation or private contracts.
Got it. Now, you sort of segued nicely into my next question, which is really going to be about, given all of this variety, given all of these different challenges and even these different definitions for what we mean by urban dynamic, how do the challenges of becoming investor ready vary for these cities? Are there themes that you've seen? Are there types of familiar challenges that cities share? In general, what is how does all this variety impact the concept of being investor ready? Julie, you can start. Or you guys can. We'll start with Julie, and since I think you got us into that question, so we can hear what Julie has to say, and then David.
Yeah, well, again, I think that depends where you are and what it is you're trying to do. Something we talked about is how cities vary in terms of their specific challenges. And if you take a city like London or a city like New York, they already attract a lot of investment, so that the challenges vary. For instance, if you look at a project like Crossrail, which is London's east-west rail link, which will be hopefully up and running in 2018, and it's going to add 10% capacity to the public transportation infrastructure in the city. It has a huge impact for London's public transportation system. The scale of a project like that is immense. Putting that in place, the planning, the preparation for that, and also how you fund that, what people are prepared to pay for, the value that adds to the city and to the people using that piece of infrastructure is quite significant in a city like London. And given things like land values, the type of people who are benefiting from it, when you look at the financing model for that, it's something that's really very sophisticated, where the beneficiaries are contributing to the financing of that piece of infrastructure. That's not something you can necessarily do in parts of the developing world at this stage, because they have to create their vision of what they want to become and where they're going, so they won't necessarily be able to get that investment in the same way. They may have to look to different forms of investment, and also they may seek some kind of bank funding or such like to give the confidence a bit of the investors, certainly give them some confidence in investing in that project, so it shows some level of security to them.
Got it. David?
I guess maybe going back to the theme of experience, through, I would say, the past 10 or 20 odd years, I think investors have had a very wide-ranging experiences with different types of assets in different types of jurisdictions that have driven home some pretty crucial lessons. As Julie sort of indicated, and as we set out in the report, in a particularly dense center, you sometimes can have a situation whereby overbuilding and building up rather than building sideways is A, the only way to go, and B, brings a great deal of value to quite a few people in a very small geographic microclimate around that asset. And you can have a situation where the attractiveness of that area is known and is further enhanced by the investment, and a significant amount of that value is extracted by the people who live and work nearby, and they're happy to pay for that. And then the other extreme, and across a number of countries, you had situations where roads were effectively built to nowhere, and you had toll roads where investors have had quite significant losses. So I think playing on my earlier theme of density, I think that investors have come to start to understand a bit more about what risks are aligned with the performance of an economy, the GDP of a given economy. What are focused more on a catchment area of individuals, and I think that they are using what they've learned in other sectors, transport more broadly, energy sectors, to sort of understand as they look at individual propositions at quite a granular level, what kind of risks are they being asked to take in terms of the competition or the contestability that may come along. Disruptive innovation happens in lots of industries, less and less in infrastructure, but actually, if you look at the classic example about wireless leapfrogging wired networks, you can end up with a redundant asset in the infrastructure space. So I think the increasing view around the economic levers of what make an asset good and bad, as well as the risk of innovation rendering your asset unrecoverable, are the same lessons that investors are applying when they look at individual cities, which are as varied as grains on a sandy beach.
Got it. Julie, a question for you. There's a term that's become quite mainstream now, which is this idea of resilience. And obviously, given all of this, all of these different, this huge variety of cities and huge variety of problems, obviously the first phase in a city is to identify what those problems are, what those challenges are, what it means to that particular city to be resilient. Given that a city has reached that point, how can they best communicate their understanding of this concept, this resilience, with potential investors?
Yeah, well, I think one of the key things, and something we talk about in the report, although we don't go into much detail on this, is really about creating that vision and that brand for your city. So if a city is following a particular path and they are seeking to future-proof the city around maybe energy or transportation, then it's really about how do you message that, how do you get that message and communicate that out to potential investors. On that topic, I would ask the audience to look at the Chattanooga case study in the report, which is a really good example of a city that has been through depression and recession and bounces back, but nevertheless something comes along to bring it down. And what we've seen with Chattanooga is their understanding of the marketplace, the need for resilient energy networks. It's a city that was hit quite badly in the past by extreme weather events that took out its energy networks and the loss of energy, what that meant for businesses. They understood that as a city, and they put in place a smart grid to create resilience within that energy network. And what they've done is they've got that message out to people, and the amount of investment that has come to that city. There are people who are working very much on digital platforms. They know they can go to Chattanooga, they can set up their business there, and they're going to be up and running. There's going to be a very small chance of the energy network being taken out through these extreme events that we're seeing all around the world. So I think it's really about understanding what those issues are and looking to industry and to commerce to see to whom are these issues important, and who's looking to locate in cities like your own, and how do you target them? How do you attract them into your city based on the work that you've done, your understanding of your local issues and how you're dealing with them? And cities may compare themselves with one another in respect of this. And then we did a piece of work for New York following Hurricane Sandy that looked at their energy resilience and what that meant for them, how that affected investment, and should they not undertake the investment, then what would happen to business? Would business move out of the city? Would other things happen as a result of a poor energy infrastructure? So I think it's really understanding who your audience is, who your potential investors might be, and really getting the message out to them and focusing on them directly and targeting them to come invest in your city.
Very interesting. Now, you brought out some of the case studies that are in the report. One of the other ones is about a cable car that was built in Medellin in Colombia, which used some very creative funding methods to get built. As a matter of fact, I believe it was using carbon trading as part of its funding. David, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that particular case study, and perhaps some other innovative, some ideas for innovative funding that you might recommend for cities, given that most of them are generally strapped for cash.
Sure. I think maybe two slightly opposing messages, which are hopefully constructive. One, and the most important one, is that there's no such thing as free money. However, what there is many times overlooked sources, as well as the impact of new markets and new policy decisions. So you've made reference to carbon trading, and indeed in markets where that exists, and it's certainly not every market, the impact of too high or too low a carbon price is a major signal to investment. And it's one of the reasons why in Europe we have the energy market that we do, is a function of relatively low carbon prices. And if you had higher carbon prices, you would get a very different type of investment signal that was occurring. And that is essentially a market that has been created more or less out of thin air by political reality. You could almost compare that to, I guess, another market that has been created in some jurisdictions, and that is where the central government will give you a loan guarantee, but only for a certain amount of money, or they will take certain risks. So if you look at a multilateral lender, say like the European Investment Bank, they've developed a infrastructure financing instrument which will only take certain targeted risks, and the purpose of that is to unlock other money that would be found from more traditionally banks or insurance companies or other private investors. However, you have potentially a wider role of groups of governments and in some cases quasi-non-governmental organizations who can provide that little bit of risk capital to unlock other capital. And again, on the theme that there is no free money, the application processes for these are generally set up in a very rigorous manner because the public officials who are tasked with giving the money out have to obviously maintain probity. They don't want to lose money. In some cases, there are state aid considerations. Applicants have to consider all of these factors, and through going through those processes, they can increase the discipline of their project preparation. And by the time they come to market, they are funded as opposed to financed. That's an important distinction. And then they're, in some cases, ready to go, and in other cases, they're sent back to the drawing board for very good reasons. So I think a balance of user charging and of seed money or de-risking from certain multilaterals, and indeed participation of other levels of government in the United States. Tax hypothecation is an important part of infrastructure finance. So certainly not every city has that type of interaction or centrality with its central government, but if an enormous part of the financing levers are being delivered centrally through either taxation policy or through guarantee, then that maybe is a new dynamic for that city to explore those funding mechanisms.
Good. Very good. Now, this question will be for Mukhtiar. I'm curious, given what David just went through, let's talk about cities specifically in developing regions, places where the financial institutions may not be quite as advanced as elsewhere. Any specific advice or thoughts on how cities in the developing world can begin their journey towards this investor-ready concept?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important, going back to some of the early points about understanding where cities are standing in terms of the maturity and the state of the legal regulatory codes in which they're operating. Otherwise, there is a very real danger if that legal environment is something akin to an undeveloped, untarmacked road, of recommending and then adopting essentially the Maserati of funding structures, when actually what they need is something much more simple. A tractor, I mean, it might not look as attractive, but it would certainly get things moving in that environment. So that there are some very basic institutional building blocks that need to be put in place in terms of addressing institutional standards of probity, governance, and transparency, because as David alluded to, I mean, essentially investors will be looking to have certainty that they can get their capital back and that profits generated from projects can be captured and repatriated. So in terms of those basic fundamentals, there are, for example, the ability for the city to present a single face to the private sector community when interacting with them and communicating these messages, whether that's through, we're talking in the report about single point vehicles, which are able to corral multiple sources of funding, as well as potentially grant permits to bring forward and assemble land, and ultimately to procure and potentially deliver particular projects. But underlying that, there are other fundamentals which will be required, which need to be addressed in terms of contract and particular property rights being recognized, enforceable, and freely transferable, as well as security being able to be taken over assets and, for example, land registration systems being in place and title recognized. So there are a number of steps that need to be taken, and these do require to be taken well in advance. And there's a mixture there of private contract structures as well as public law intervention, which will require a liaison with central government and legislators. But as part of that, I think it's really important that both investors and cities are conscious of the fact that these concepts are not simply illusory. But it's possible to download virtually whole tracts of legislation overnight, but unless they're supported by the institutional framework of government, it's something akin to going back to the tractor and car analogy of downloading a supercharged engine of highly refined legislation into a car that doesn't have any wheels. So it needs to be thought about in the round. It needs to be done well in advance. And of course, once it is in place, it does need to be clear, transparent, and consistent application of those legal regulatory codes and frameworks. And that there aren't any arbitrary decisions taken not to apply them, because ultimately that will kill investor confidence.
Got it. And a question for everybody, just play devil's advocate here. What happens when this doesn't work out? You know, when an investment just doesn't pay off? Are there basic things that a city can do to protect themselves from the impact of that so they're not left bearing the brunt? We can start with Julie. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to Mukhtiar's point that he made just now, which is really about that preparation, getting things right from the start, which is really why we've written the report the way we have and focused very heavily on the governance issues. It's really, if cities understand what they need to do from the outset and they've got the right guidance to help them do that, then these sorts of events hopefully can be avoided. Mukhtiar is the expert on the details around that, but it really is essential to get those things in place right from the outset. So I think I'll pass over to the expert on that issue.
Thanks. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think it's getting it right at the beginning. I mean, ultimately, it's coming back to David's point that investors will require to have confidence that the investments that they're making will be so the finance they're making available can be repaid. So, and ultimately, the city has to repay. So we're obviously all aware of some highly publicised examples of where they are unable to pay. So there is little they can do other than planning well in advance and making sure that they put in place the structures to enable apportionment and allocation of risk to the appropriate bodies that are able to carry that risk. Now, that may well be ultimately sitting with central government or a multilateral agency which is providing some form of guarantee or wrapper, or it may sit at city level at a particular product level, but ultimately if things go wrong, the party that is carrying that risk has to meet it.
We have a question from the audience, speaking to the business case for private investors to invest in infrastructure. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to the role that private investment may play in all of this, and specifically whether or not incentives exist in cities and communities to incentivize the private sector to make more resilient infrastructure investments of their own, so that especially in regards to things like natural hazards and floods and so on. So, role of the private sector in all of this?
Shall I start on that very quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Well, I would pick up on the point that Siemens is also an investor. We have Siemens Financial Services, and we're involved in what's called vendor financing. And when I sat down with our people from Siemens Financial Services, asked them very direct questions about what they need and are there reasons why they wouldn't invest and what do they need to see in place before they will take their investment to a particular project in a particular city. And what they said is, the same as any other bank, and it's all those assurances that Mukhtiar mentioned earlier. We need to know that the legal frameworks are in place to protect our investments and all the other securities that we would look for. And if we were investing, we would do our due diligence. We invest in our own portfolio elements and not beyond that. But nevertheless, to ensure that a project's going to be successful, we need to do due diligence on that, and we need to know that everyone else involved in that project has undertaken the necessary checks and measures to ensure it's going to be a successful project. So I would say that's from our point of view as a potential investor or part investor in projects we're involved in.
Great. David, your thoughts on this issue with the private sector?
Sure. I think there's two sides to that, and I think they hopefully dovetail neatly with the points that other presenters have so vaguely made. And one of them is that you can see in some cases the public sector using the private sector as a screen, if you will, against viability of good versus not so good projects through all of the mechanisms we've been discussing before. So if you look at multilaterals, or in the United States, the Transport Finance Administration and their TIFIA program, they are limiting the government involvement to a certain percentage and requiring that the private side of that equation stacks up. And that can be required through a minimum credit rating or other quality participation measures that government doesn't have time to necessarily sift through all these schemes. And indeed, they don't, in some cases, always have the expertise, not because they're not able, simply because it doesn't generally pay them to have those resources in their organizations. And they look to the other half, the private side of the scheme, to sift the good from the bad. Now, from the investor's perspective, I think there are some fairly attractive features generally for a quality project, and depends on the type of investor, but in some cases they're very long, and that can suit you if you are an insurance company or a pension fund. They can offer inflation protection, which can be extremely attractive, again, depending on the nature of the liabilities they're trying to match off. And also, if you look back through the financial crisis, from a credit perspective, they actually perform very well. And institutions that became overweight in infrastructure generally found, because they were underweight in everything else, and then infrastructure became the long pole in the tent as a lot of other asset classes collapsed. And I think that has been noticed. Infrastructure isn't necessarily big enough to be its own asset class, but it has some defensive, robust, long-term inflation protection characteristics that investors really struggle to find anywhere else. They can find them in the government debt market, but in some cases that's pretty fully priced right now.
Got it. Mukhtiar, do you have thoughts on the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I want to just sort of take a slightly different slant in terms of private sector investor, and when we talk about investors, not simply in the context of investing in particular infrastructure assets, but also investors in the wider urban environment and in wider regenerative context. Businesses deciding to relocate to a particular city and invest in that environment. And for investors in that broader context, they need to have comfort that that the city understands the challenges that it's facing and has and is able to accommodate them as a credible and deliverable and indeed, most importantly, a fundable program to address those challenges as a wider program of infrastructure investments. And certainly from our perspective and looking at it in a wider regenerative context, it's the appreciation and the linkage of the value created by infrastructure in conjunction with real estate and actually forward planning to capture that value, which is key. Otherwise, you end up with the danger of disparate and piecemeal infrastructure interventions rather than thinking about it in a holistic sense. And we touch on this in the report in terms of the building blocks, the beginnings of this is looking at land value capture and structuring partnered or joint venture arrangements to enable long-term strategic views to be taken to capture value rather than simply trading assets, through to more complex cost-sharing regimes where that there's a clear understanding that development consents are being granted through a planning framework for areas which would benefit from infrastructure investment in return for a contribution towards that infrastructure, and whether that's a lump sum contribution or a more evolved community infrastructure levy we talk about in the report, etc., where needs are assessed, costed and shared on a unitized basis. All of those require, certainly from the legal piece, rather than actually a specific project piece, some front-end legal structure which takes time to put in place. Otherwise, there is always the danger that you're trying to adopt Maseratis when actually there's something more straightforward which is required.
Got it. So we've got time for one last pretty quick answer question, and I wanted to make it a fun one. The report is full of case studies. I think there's at least 8 or 9. And I'd also remind people, if you haven't read the report, there's a link right above this video where you can download it. If you can't find it, contact us. We'll send you a link. The report's full of case studies. I'm curious if you could each just pick one that you felt is particularly meaningful, particularly insightful, and tell us a little bit about it and why you would pick it as a particularly significant case study. We'll go in order, so we'll start with you, Julie.
Okay. Well, mine is without doubt Medellin. It's for me one of the best urban development transformation stories in the world. I'd invite people to read the report to find out a little bit more about that, or visit Medellin and experience what a fantastic city that is. Was last year awarded the accolade of being the most innovative city in the world from the Urban Land Institute and the Wall Street Journal as a result of what's happened following the implementation of the cable car. Medellin has moved from the deadliest city in the world to the most innovative city. So it's great to see what's happening there, not just from an infrastructure point of view, but how that has, as a physical mobility story, turned into one around social mobility and economic mobility, the changes that's had on the city. And in a country like Colombia, where you might not expect to find a story like that, it's a city that, through good leadership, has implemented a piece of infrastructure that was appropriate in context. They didn't aim to go for something really big and fancy and expensive. They went for what was appropriate, and it has had an amazing impact. So that, for me, is a story I talk about whenever I'm speaking publicly, and one I hope the readers will enjoy when they read the report.
Yeah, Medellin's been on my list of cities to visit one of these days, so that adds some inspiration. David, any particular case study in the report that speaks to you?
I like the Singapore water case study, because I think that is a fairly impressive example of turning adversity into something that works very, very well from a financial, technological, and indeed a social perspective. I think that the administration has used a great number of tools, not any of just those individual financial levers or technical levers. They've used them all as part of a system based on behaviors, and really maximized the use of a scarce resource extremely well in a sustainable manner.
Good. Mukhtiar?
Sure. In fact, I was also going to mention Medellin, not least because I was out there a month or two ago. But in addition to Medellin, I guess I'd also talk about Puerto Maravilla in Rio, in terms of what was quite an interesting and innovative structure that they used for capturing value, and ultimately being able to incentivize development through creating freely tradable property rights, which was quite innovative, and also it goes beyond some of the concepts that we're used to here in the UK, for example, through sills, because it allows policy to be levered through, or rather after the grant of the original planning consent, through the issuing of further what we call CPACs, and the pricing of those CPACs as the development process goes on. So it's very innovative, and that's quite an interesting one as well.
Good. Well, I think that about wraps up our time today. I want to thank you all so much for taking time out of your day, and in your case, your evening, to join us. And thanks to everybody who watched. This video will be, as soon as this is done, will be archived as a YouTube video. You're welcome to pass that around as you like. And again, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.